Alhamdulillah. Yes, that's that hot sauce from the Imam. And Alhamdulillah is proud, mashallah, it is what it is. It's like Allah, by His providence, gives evidence. We have one of those true leaders that ride along with us every week on this. Those things that the Imam was speaking about in terms of our education and making that education relevant for us. That's what Tyson, he's shown it, he's demonstrated, he's lived it, he walked the walk, talked the talk. But I'm not gonna stay on him. We got every week. We get with him every week. But let's so then let's move on. Everything that the Imam is saying, all that criticism, that's like 10 minutes out of a talk. The Imam addressed us for 33 years, but that's like 10 minutes out of the talk. But it's a sample, just like somebody takes a sample out of the ocean and to find out how many parts per gallon or per whatever does this exist. That's a sample. I got to keep going. So the hereditary, everything, the criticism that the Imam gave there in 1986. In 1986, let's do the math. 1986, that's 14 to get you to 2000, 14 years to get you to 2000. And we're in 2024 and in an election year, I might add. That's what, 14 plus 24, that's 38 years. That's almost 4 decades. How much of what Imam Muhammad has said is irrelevant today? That's out of a 10-minute clip. How much of what he said is irrelevant today? All of it is relevant today. All of it is relevant. In fact, this one hip hop dude, I said, I'm gonna go ahead and leave his name out of it. I just leave his name out. Whatever. His whole thing is literally conspicuous consumption. I mean, he's proud of showing his Buddha level, no disrespect to Buddha, his Buddha level body, and eating chicken, and just showing off this opulence of wealth, etc. But it's waste. It's waste. We can waste. So it's the same thing on magnified, right? All that's Negrosis. I mean, all of it. Just look at what is glorified, what is followed, what is adored, what is worshipped. What gets paid in this world. It's all of that is Negrosis. That's death on all of these levels. So to speak to this hereditary predisposition to this condition, that's why it still exists. 38 years after Imam talked to us about it, and it existed before his time, okay? Why does it exist? Because there's a hereditary predisposition to this behavior, okay? The name for African Americans in their most fallen condition is Negro. That's the name. I'm talking technically, all right? Negro is the name for the dead. Dead to what? To their original humanity. Negro is from necro. Necromancy is black magic, right? That's Negro is necro, right? When a person, for example, a female, has inherited a gene mutation from her mother that increases her risk of developing cancer, she is referred to as a carrier of that mutation. If it's specifically about a cancer-prone gene, such as BRCA1 or BRCA2, and mashallah, my sisters and my mother fit this category. Rahimahullah, for our mother who's passed away, alhamdulillah, died as a Muslim, having made Hajj, mashallah, alhamdulillah. If it's specifically about a cancer-prone gene, such as BRCA1 or BRCA2 genes, which are linked to a higher risk of breast and ovarian cancer, the person would be described as carrying a genetic predisposition to cancer. This condition is often discussed in the context of hereditary cancer syndromes, where mutations in specific genes, as the ones we've expressed, are passed down from one generation to the next, increasing the risk of certain types of cancer. People who inherit these mutations are not guaranteed to develop cancer but have a significantly higher risk compared to the general population. When a people have inherited psychological and sociocultural trauma from their ancestors, that increases their risk of developing a collective psychosocial condition tied to historical oppression. They may be considered carriers of that trauma. Specifically in the case of Negrosis, this inherited trauma is linked to a higher risk of developing both mental and physical symptoms associated with generational stress caused by the enduring effects of the caste system, i.e., the vicious cycle of racism and oppression. Meaning, chattel slavery stripped us of all the things, dehumanized us, make it short. It dehumanized us. It created the Negro. The generations that followed continued the environment that put the stress on that makeup, and the survival mechanism that came out of that were the attributes and the qualities that fit the situation that we found ourselves continuing facing. However, that, as Frederick Douglass talks about, the advert being surrounded by an adverse settlement, meaning that we were surrounded by a situation that constantly pressed upon us and stressed us in a certain way, such that it caused that mutation to have a place and a purpose, and what the one author, and we're going to get to that too, one author calls survival energy. We had to always have our survival energy up because we're in an environment that threatens us and stresses us so much so, but there's a mechanism inside of our makeup that's designed to help us survive in these adverse circumstances, okay? But that same quality, we're going to come to that too, that those same qualities that was functional in one environment, very much like sickle cell, right? In the sickle cell situation, yeah, there was a place and a time where that particular mutation, quote unquote, was necessary because the environment called for that in order to survive. But when that environment changes, then it becomes diseased in a way that is not, obviously not healthy, but it's only so because of the changed environment. But let's move on. So this condition is the hereditary Negrosis syndrome. That is, we as a people carry that gene, all right? And this syndrome, when it arises, it is the hereditary Negrosis syndrome, where deep-seated trauma from historical events, as the Imam just talked to us about that slave ghost that he didn't follow Garvey, he didn't follow any of the other, he just existed, but he was seeing what the slave master had and wanting what the slave master had. When circumstances in our life come up, that hearken to and activate and provoke that sensibility in us, it comes up in us at an unconscious level, but we react and act just like that slave on the plantation. So where our deep-seated trauma from historical events like chattel slavery is passed down from one generation to the next, increasing the risk of certain psychosocial and physical conditions, everyone who inherits these patterns of trauma is not guaranteed. Meaning, it's not every African American you look at, they are not having cases of full-blown negrosis, but they are carriers of that gene, right? Everyone who inherits these patterns of trauma is not guaranteed to manifest all the symptoms. Still, they are significantly higher risk compared to other ethnic groups due to the compounded effects of intergenerational stress and psychological burden. That's what the Imam talked about in the clip that we played. He said, look at the Cubans when they come over and they do it. Look at the Haitians when they come over. And we saw from Marcus Mosiah Garvey, the presentation was good. Jamaicans, etc., Africans, etc. I remember in Bed-Stuy. I don't know if Bed-Stuy is in Brooklyn now. I ain't got all that worked out. But I remember the article, it was about Bed-Stuy with Bedford Stuyvesant, that the way that they came in, that is the Haitians, they came in and just we would call it, if white folks did it, we would call it gentrification. I don't know what you call it when people that have the same skin color as you and the same melanin, when they come and do it, what do you call it then, right? So the idea is that, and there are many, there's so, mashallah, I gotta slow down. I have so many studies that just point out that, look, it ain't your skin color. That ain't what's doing it. When you talk about college performance and college acceptance and those kinds of things and the economic development and then the article on the Bed-Stuy piece, that article, it wasn't a Muslim article, it was just an article that their conclusion essentially was that, well, what distinguishes, why is it that the quote unquote the Negroes and the blacks that have been there, why haven't they progressed and progressed in advance, and why didn't they do what the Haitians did in that area? And one of the things was, one of the conclusions was, it was because they, the ones who succeeded, they didn't drink how can you say, self-depreciation and fear and doubt. They didn't sip it from their mother's breast milk. He said the quote unquote Negroes, same skin color, etc., they drank this self-deprecation, this self-doubt, this fear. They drank that from their mother's breast milk. It is what it is, brother and sister. This is how this hereditary Negrosis syndrome, this is how it continues to come to us. And that is literal. That's not rhetoric. When you understand the biology of it, the neurobiology of it, when you understand the genetics of it, that is the case, right? And when in the Imam statement, where it says that Allah will never change the grace he bestows them until they change what's bothering them in their own soul. There's the internal wherewithal. There's the built-in, there's the triggering. I'm talking about the genetics aspect of it. It triggers certain neurochemicals that are in the blood. And in consequence of that, it becomes a part of what is absorbed. Now, you get it from the environment, and you're also getting it from the genetics. You're getting it from the very way that we're nurtured. So we're raised and nurtured on that. And so that's what has to be totally transformed. So one of those critical research pieces is under the title Nostalgia as the Enabler of Self-Continuity. Don't let these words scare you, okay? Here is a term. Need to understand it. Remember, call things by their proper names. Once you know what the name is, then you can get a grasp of it. Diachronic discontinuity, okay? Diachronic means across time. Diachronic. Chronic is time. Diachronic, across time. Discontinuity. Discontinuity is disconnected. So there was a continuity, but that continuity got broken. All right? There was a continuity in time, but it got broken. Diachronic discontinuity. All right? So diachronic discontinuity refers to a disconnection or a rupture in identity continuity over time. This is anybody. This is not just slaves, okay? This is anybody who suffers this diachronic discontinuity, this disconnection or rupture in identity continuity over time. The research shows that a lack of continuity is a source of psychological maladjustment. If you suffer this diachronic discontinuity, if you suffer this identity loss of identity continuity, then that lack of continuity is a source of psychological maladjustment. Other perils of discontinuity include, remember this, every list we make about that condition is always going to be a partial list. But even on the partial list, it is it's tragic. I can't think of a better word. So this lack of continuity is a source of psychological maladjustment, and other perils of this discontinuity, meaning a short list of some of the things that actually come with this condition is negative affect, meaning just generally inclined to negative emotions, right? Negative affect, anxiety, alienation, a weakening of group identification, meaning that we don't get together, right? There's a weakening of we don't identify with each other in a way that consolidates and that creates this cohesion, etc. A weakening of group identification and the emergence of group schisms and even suicide. That's just a partial list of people who suffer diachronic discontinuity, who suffer a break in their identity continuity. That happens in the personal life of an individual. Let's keep reading. In the personal lives of individuals, diachronic discontinuity can be caused by a variety of factors, including disruptive life events, meaning that I'm talking personal right here. This happens in one person's lifetime. Disruptive life events such as relationship breakups, occupational crises, health deterioration, or the death of a loved one. All these things can bring about this diachronic discontinuity, this break of identity continuity. Going on, such events create a contrast between the past and the present selves, okay? Yourself. Something happened inside of yourself, your psyche. There was you of the past, then there was this thing that happened, and then now you don't know where you are, when you are, who you are. That's how tragic, what we call them sometimes, significant emotional events. Those things can just cause a complete break in your psyche. We call it nervous breakdown. It can be cause a break between your past self and your present self and lead to emotional distress. That's in your personal lives, right? One lifetime, right? Additionally, psychological threats to identity, significant life transitions like geographic or occupational mobility, right? Your job moves from the south to the north or from the north to the south, and either you do go or you can't go with them. That is a powerful impact on your life and on your identity overall, right? And what will happen is an individual's perception of disunity between the different phases of their life can also disrupt the continuity of identity, causing feelings of disconnection from one's past self. It's very important. This has occurred on the personal and collective level with African Americans on the whole, as a consequence of chattel slavery and the history of systemic racism and oppression that followed. So it's like we know this reality happens in the life of an individual. What we have to embrace is the fact that this is what has happened to the whole people that are African American. We are still suffering from the traumatic consequences that brought about this identity discontinuity in us, and we haven't got it back together as a whole. All right? We're still suffering that. It's an inherited, it's a congenital. This is the explanation for how is it and why is it that we can't get through. Brother, you getting triggered. If that's what you call it, mashallah. Let's move on. Beautiful book, My Grandmother's Hands. Brother Ali, some of y'all know Brother Ali, famous of the Brother Ali is Blind brand and music, etc. Shout out. He recommended this book to me. It's a very, very profound, important book. And it talks about the trauma, that the trauma lives in our body. This is the thing that we're trying to get to. It's if you got this melanin, you got this, and you are American in the pharmacy. Now it's like if you're Haitian, if you're Jamaican, if you're Trinidad and Tobago. I'm thinking of my brother Imam out of Fresno. Sorry, brother Imam, I'm moving on right now. It's like you will not necessarily have that depth of it. But if you bona fide American and you trace your lineage in these more recent generations to the South and etc., yeah, you are a carrier of that particular predisposition. All right. In My Grandmother's Hands, his Resma Menachem is his name, discusses the deep-seated trauma experienced by African Americans due to centuries of systemic violence, oppression, and dehumanization. This trauma, often compounded across generations, manifests as self-hate and a bodily stored survival energy, often unconsciously affecting the behavior and mental well-being of many African Americans. He contrasts this experience with the immigrants who, despite facing hardship, largely maintained their cultural identity, which we just spoke of, while African Americans were systematically stripped of their languages, family, and identity. Menachem also highlights the pervasive nonverbal sensations white bodies, that is, they have something in their bodies just like blacks have something in their bodies, the sensation that white bodies hold regarding black bodies, seeing them as, that is through the white eyes, quote unquote, using white with air quotes, the white eyes, and they look and they're seeing the blacks as dangerous, impervious to pain, hypersexual, and in need of control, right? Think about Project 2025 and the Great Replacement Theory and why they want to get rid of critical race theory in the schools, blah, blah, blah. All of that is coming from that. Understand that. It's coming from those quote unquote white bodies. We can talk about melanin when we talk about us. I know everybody has some melanin, maybe not the same amount, but let's move on past that. That's beyond the pale of our conversation right here. But it's in the bodies, right? Both black and white. These false, from both perspectives, these false but deeply ingrained perceptions are passed down generationally and shape the ongoing racial dynamic in the U.S. This is one of those Star Trek episodes right here. Now I remember, of course, mashallah, from the time I used to be the full-blown, Star Trek guy. I love the black and whites. Jim Kirk. Let's move on. This one, Let That Be Your Last Battleground, episode 70, right, from that original series, right? There's this was the battle between these two, the two that are imaged. Now, those of you who are, the only way that you can really see the slides that we're talking about, you have to go to masjidwartheen.org. The note is there, but masjidwartheen.org, and click on the Rise link, and you will be brought to the Zoom presentation that I'm giving this on. In any case, so let me just read this line here. He said, they have been, I was interested, I knew the series, I knew what was happening, I knew the episode, I knew what was happening, but I couldn't remember how long they'd been chasing each other across the galaxies, right? One was a escaped slave, and the other was the slave catcher, right? And I knew it had been a very long time, but I didn't know how long it was. So I had to look up, okay, how long were they, chasing each other? And here's what the note is. In the episode itself, they have been enemies for approximately 50,000 years due to racial discrimination. And the racial discrimination was based on the fact that Bella's, I guess I will say it that way, Bella's people were black on the right side of their bodies and white on the left side of the bodies. And Loki's people were the opposite, meaning they were white on the right side of their bodies and black on the left side of their bodies. And this was the foundation for the intense racial hatred that has persisted with them for millennia, ultimately leading to the destruction of their planet and civilization, leaving them the only known survivors, meaning that relationship was such that it destroyed the whole planet that they lived on. And they still chased each other, one running and one chasing across the galaxies, based on this racial idea is that I'm superior, you're inferior, you're different than me, and superior slash inferior, uh, only because my black is on the left side and your black is on the right side. This is satirically pointing to the idiocy of it, but it's also pointing to the intractability of it and the inheritance of a craziness. I'm not going to try to find any other words other than that. But that's the craziness that we're trapped in. That's the loop that we're trapped in right now. Again, with this Project 2025, Great Replacement Theory, all these are just new names for stuff that has been named before. Phrenology and whatever, drapetomania, and all these crazy names and labels and terms that have been used to dredge up and to perpetuate the caste system and the racism and the deprivation that one wants to put over the other. That's what we're faced with right now. And in this election, in this election year, you should know this is the same episode being repeated in our life right now. We have inherited, if you will, we have inherited this historical, congenital, oppositional position of people of color because of the master narrative of white supremacy, and quote unquote that kind of racism, as Aldous Huxley called it, man's most dangerous myth, the myth of race. Zionism is racism. That craziness is rooted in a race narrative. But I digress. Let's move on. Let's see. Okay. Going on, continuing in my grandmother's hands, that the trauma lives in our bodies. That culture is in our bodies too. It's very important to understand this. Culture is in our bodies. Culture and trauma are deeply embedded in the bodies of African Americans and everybody. I'm talking about Italians and Jews and any other European, African, Asian, etc. The culture is in the bodies, right? Deeply embedded in the bodies of African Americans, passed down across generations as physical, emotional, and psychological imprints. As Menachem explains, generation after generation, our bodies stored trauma and intense survival energy and passed these on to our children and grandchildren. For well over 300 years, the Black body in America has been systematically brutalized, mutilated, murdered, abused, controlled, raped, objectified, and demonized. Right? I mean, you there's a list. Say their names, right? Just find that. Just say their names, and it's like, and you got this whole list that verify this, right? Ta-Nehisi Coates, he did a great job. He's an atheist. Moving on, I want you to know that I know that, but most atheism is based upon the God that you've been shown and you've been told about, and the people who told you about that God and what they show is like, okay, you're an atheist against what you know, what you've been told about God. But I'm not trying to answer that issue right now. The point is that one of the most articulate presentations of the issue that I'm talking to you about right now is there in that book. Between I think it's called Between the World. I know Tyson. No, Tyson, shout out. What's the full name of that book?
Between the World and Me. That's the one we're talking about.
Exactly, that's what I'm talking about. Okay, Between the World and Me. Y'all should read that. It's good. It's a great book. Okay, so it says the trauma upon trauma compounded. That's our life, right? This illustrates how cultural experiences, especially those involving collective trauma, are carried within the body, influencing behavior and health on a generational level, reinforcing the idea that culture lives in our bodies. Brother and sister, these are concrete scientific facts that we have to include in our perception, in our conceptualization, in our understanding. We are carriers of trauma. Now, what anybody else does in light of that fact, or says, or theorizes, or therapeutically prescribes, I'm not trying to account for that, and I'm not trying to refute or endorse that. I'm saying right now, we need to understand that it is with us in our bodies, right? And if we don't understand how it manifests and understand what evokes it, provokes it, potentiates it, actualizes it, it's going to continue to happen unbeknownst to ourselves as to where's that coming from. It's coming from that slave ghost. It's coming from that congenital condition. It's a manifestation of negrosis. Another one, Dr. Joy DeGroot, her work, particularly the concept of post-traumatic slave syndrome, said it resonates strongly with the statement regarding generational trauma passed down among African Americans. In her book, she explores how the trauma experienced during slavery and subsequent systemic racism has been passed down through generations affecting the behavior, mental health, and social conditions of African Americans today, still affecting us today. In the book, she states, generations after African Americans survived by relying on their instincts and survival mechanisms, these behaviors, while adaptive for slavery and the oppressive periods thereafter, have been passed down and have become maladaptive. Like, again, as we say, sickle cell anemia was a reaction against a protection and immune response to malaria, okay? But when you come into America and you are a carrier in the hereditary predisposition case, then that same adaptive immune response is maladaptive in the new environment. Such is the case with our history. So those things that have been passed down have become maladaptive in today's society. The trauma didn't end with slavery. It was compounded with each generation. So that means it's existing right now with us and can be activated under a plurality of circumstances. The historical trauma experienced by African American population has contributed to a biological predisposition towards specific psychological and physiological responses, which I have grouped under the term negrosis. So when you see maladaptive, dysfunctional, psychological traits and behaviors that are not conducive to our well-being, going forward, succeeding, etc., just put your finger on it and call it negrosis. That's what it is. That's where it's coming from. That negro, I don't care if you're wearing a kufi, kimar, thobe, dashiki, when that behavior, when you see that behavior, which is not contributed to our success and forward going, what you are seeing, what you are experiencing there is negrosis. Let's see if we can move through this. I would like to. I may wind up taking a little more of your time than originally anticipated, but of course, you're free. I hope many of you actually have seen the TV series House. I think I watched all of them. I think I bought the sets and just went through all of them. But here's the synopsis of the series itself. At fictional Princeton Plainsboro Teaching Hospital in New Jersey, prickly genius Dr. Gregory House tackles health mysteries as would a medical Sherlock Holmes, all the while playing mind games with colleagues, that include his best friend, oncologist James Wilson, House, an acerbic infectious disease specialist, solves medical puzzles with the help of a team of young diagnosticians. Flawless instincts and unconventional thinking help earn House great respect despite his brutal honesty and antisocial tendency. He's kind of a devil's advocate type character. we're gonna walk through this that we've been speaking of, but we're gonna put it in the context of the template for a House series. So this is the typical sequence of a House episode. Excuse me. That's because I've been driving my throat and stuff is getting built up. Yeah. This is how it goes. These are the sequences of an episode. First, you have the introduction of the patient and the initial symptoms, the initial consult and House's reluctance. Then also the differential diagnosis begins. Then you have the first round of tests and misdiagnosis. Then you have the complications and reassessment. Then you have the testing, the boundaries and ethics, and then you have the breakthrough. And then you have the final diagnosis and treatment, and then the patient recovers in resolution. That's how, where if it's an hour or a half hour, that's how the series goes there. So let's work through that in what we're talking about in terms of Negrosis, right? If this were an episode of House, it would feature all of the discovery of the unknown conditions that we're speaking of as Negrosis. And so based on my concept of the psychological, sociological conditions resulting from the historical trauma of slavery akin to a mental or socio-cultural syndrome, here's how it could be structured following the usual template of the show. First, there's the introduction of the patient and the initial symptoms. This episode could open with a middle-aged African-American man experiencing unusual physical and psychological symptoms, perhaps sudden muscle weakness, extreme fatigue, memory lapses, and anxiety. The scene might show him at a family gathering, seemingly disoriented, making inappropriate comments, and then collapsing on the floor in front of his family. There's a hint that these symptoms are tied to his history or background, but it's unclear how. He's rushed to the hospital where the standard tests for neurological or cardiac issues come up inconclusive. Second phase, initial consult and House's reluctance. The case reaches Dr. House's team, who at first thinks that the symptoms are due to obvious neurological disorder or maybe something psychosomatic like severe depression or schizophrenia. House, as usual, is initially uninterested, dismissing it as another case of psychosomatic garbage, but he becomes intrigued when further tests reveal no abnormalities in the brain or nervous system. He mocks the other doctors for not thinking outside the box, suggesting that they're biased by seeing the patient as, quote, just another stressed Black man. Then there's the differential diagnosis begins, meaning they try to figure out the different ways that it happens. The team gathers together for their first differential diagnosis session. They debate possibilities ranging from a rare neurological disorder to some form of chronic autoimmune disease. House pushes them to explore other explanations, noting that there's something, quote, culturally complex at play. One of the team members brings up the recent abstract that House had read on the vicious cycle of racism, which described racism as a regressive, diseased, emotional, and psychological condition of the mind that manifests covertly and subtly in society, but could have severe psychosocial effects on individuals. The abstract suggested that this complex form of racial prejudice originates in the psychological situation of the racist, but affects the social relations and mental health of its victims. And let me say, as a side note, this is actually a paper and a diagram that this is drawn from that I've actually produced, but we'll get to that maybe at another time. House muses on this abstract, Connecting it to the patient's epigenetic and psychological condition, he begins to wonder if the patient's symptoms are the result of a deeper psychological and sociological condition related to generational trauma. This leads House to propose his radical theory of negrosis, suggesting it could be an unrecognized syndrome involving both mental and physical degeneration linked to the stress of historical oppression. Fourth sequence. First round of tests and misdiagnosis. Based on the initial guesses, they tested neurological conditions like multiple sclerosis or muscular dystrophy, perhaps also testing for extreme vitamin deficiencies or rare metabolic disorders. The tests yield nothing useful, and the patient's condition worsens. The patient becomes more agitated, talking about feeling that he's trapped in another person's body. The doctors suspect that this is psychosomatic disorder stemming from mental trauma, and the team's psychiatrist suggests treating the patient for dissociative identity disorder. That's a multiple personality issue. Dissociative identity disorder or extreme PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, based on his heritage and life experience. The complication and reassessment. Okay, after a round of psychiatric treatments and therapy sessions, the patient doesn't improve. In fact, he develops new symptoms like random skin discoloration, joint pain, and severe drop in blood pressure. The team realizes that they've gone down the wrong path, and House pushes for another differential diagnosis session. House makes a passing comment about legacy diseases, while ridiculing the team, referring to genetic conditions passed down through generations. This sparks a new idea. What if the condition is the result of something that transcends traditional medical diagnosis, rooted in both biology and socio-historical experience? Number 6, testing the boundaries and ethics. House suggests the radical idea that the patient's condition could be an unknown syndrome tied to a historical trauma passed down epigenetically, something beyond current medical classification. He calls it negrosis, theorizing that it's a psychosocial and biological disorder unique to the descendants of people subjected to long-term systemic oppression, manifesting in both psychological and physical symptoms. The team is skeptical and questions the ethics of exploring such an idea without more evidence, but House insists on running an unconventional test. He orders genetic sequencing and stress-related biomarkers, looking for unusual epigenetic markers tied to trauma. Then the breakthrough. The breakthrough comes when House discovers unusual epigenetic markers in the patient's DNA that have been linked to generational trauma, as well as elevated levels of stress hormones that could only come through constant, unrelieved pressure experienced across generations. House hypothesis that negrosis could be a real undiagnosed syndrome blended with physical symptoms with psychological trauma rooted in the experience of systemic oppression, particularly in descendants of enslaved people. His insight is confirmed. By observing the patient's history, he has no personal history of trauma, but exhibits the markers that suggest intergenerational transmission of stress. House concludes, final diagnosis and treatment. House concludes that the patient is suffering from negrosis, a condition caused by the epigenetic effects of ancestral trauma compounded by his current life stressors. He prescribes an unconventional treatment of a regimen of, and here it is. Wait, let's go back. I need to switch up because there's a reveal here, and I'll do it this way. An unconventional treatment of a regimen of WD-40 and I want to change this. Bilalianium. Bilalianium. Next week, inshallah, since I finish this, then we'll be able to now go to the details. That's the one word. Bilalian is the one word. But let's go on and finish the house episode. He prescribes an unconventional treatment of a regimen of WD-40 Bilalianium, right? The WD-40 is the Farad piece. Let me just go ahead and say it. The WD-40 is the Farad piece. The Bilalianium is the Imam W.D. Muhammad piece. The composite of the two of those, that's the prescription. WD-40 and Bilalianium. So WD-40 Bilalianium, it's a medication that combines a complex series of enzymes and neurological stabilizers designed to lubricate the pathways in the brain affected by generational stress and trauma. The treatment is controversial, with the medical team unsure of the safety and efficacy of a drug so experimental. House, as always, is confident, stating that sometimes you just need to loosen the rust, talking about the rusty locks. That's what it's talking about. To loosen the rust in the machinery, need that WD-40 Bilalianium, aims to treat both the patient's physical symptoms, such as the muscular weaknesses and fatigue, and the neurological and psychological stress, essentially unsticking the trauma-affected pathways in the brain. Think, for surely thinking benefits, right? Despite the concerns, the patient begins the course of WD-40 Bilalianium. Miraculously, his symptoms start to stabilize, and the physical manifestations of his illness begin to recede. His mental state improves as well, with his memory and mood gradually returning to normal. The patient recovers, all right? And the resolution is that the patient starts recovering, showing progress both physically and mentally. In the final scenes, he expresses relief and gratitude, finally understanding that his condition wasn't all in his head, but has roots in his history and lineage. House, as usual, dismisses the emotional significance, but remarks sarcastically that he just solved racism. The episode ends with a reflective note, perhaps showing House pondering the impact of historical trauma in medicine, but quickly shifting back to his old irreverent self. And last play for today. So the social commentary that comes out of the episode is that the episode explores the intersection between medicine, culture, and history. These are the facts of our situation that we're talking about. There is this intersection of medicine, culture, and history, and it raises questions about how intergenerational trauma can manifest in ways modern science has yet to fully understand. There's not been this scientific MIT, Harvard, whatever, John Hopkins study of what we're talking about, but this is the case, and we don't have to wait for them to say, well, you're right. No, it's the case before you say it. House's character arc is that his usual cynical attitude could be challenged by the idea that something as intangible as history and culture can have such a tangible effect on the body, adding depth to his character. That's for his character arc. In terms of the ethical debate, the team would likely debate whether the idea of diagnosing a condition like negrosis is scientifically sound, or if it risks over medicalizing cultural experiences, adding tension to the narrative. So that's just talking about it, talking about how the movie, the series would end. So the point here, brother and sister, is to understand that by naming things correctly, by naming the negrosis, and that is to understand the science that is inside of our condition, and understanding the intergenerational quality of it, and recognizing when you recognize that, when you recognize all of the symptoms that are involved with the reality of this condition, then, so what's coming up, inshallah, next week, inshallah, since I've covered this much of it, the Negrosis, what defining the problem, seeing where the problem lies, etc. Now the one word which I've told you, the one word that does it is Bilal. Bilal and Bilalian, it does it. Now we're gonna take, inshallah, maybe about the same amount of time next week to establish that as a fact. All right. So I won't even go into the different areas and categories that have to be covered in order for that to become an established matter. That's what next week is for. So inshallah, I hope you can be with us. So let me go ahead and it's your turn. Comments respecting the protocols and circumstances. But that's it for my part right now. All right, others. Oh, I don't need to switch up. Speak now, forever hold your peace. Oh, first, Tyson. Tyson, you got anything you want to bring?
Alhamdulillah, just thank you. This is always, man, it's a beautiful lesson to be able to learn this directly, especially hearing the recordings of the Imam. Thank you for presenting all of that.
You probably felt the same way in hearing him at that time in 1986. Where were you in 1986?
1986, yeah, I was here in the Bay. I was in San Jose, probably running around on the field playing flag football or at a playground or something. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. So it's like when I heard Marcus Garvey, when the first time I heard one of his, it's like, man, he was putting it down like that. It's like, wow. Yeah, so it's really, really something. All right, others, comments. Don't be shy, because I got my finger on the exit button right now. All right. Love y'all. Everybody take care. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.